Good day, everyone. Thank you for your patience. We welcome you to today's webinar on climate justice for gender-responsive and resilient communities. My name is Joy Rocamora, and I am a research associate for the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines and a master's student of the Disaster Risk and Resilience Program of the Ateneo. Before we begin, please be guided of the house rules for today's session. So this event is being recorded for documentation purposes, and all guests and participants are automatically muted upon entry. For panelists, please keep your video off and your microphone muted, especially if it is not your turn to speak yet. For attendees, please send your questions, specifying to whom it is addressed to through the Zoom chat box, so that we can note this and raise it during our open forum. So let us now start the webinar with welcome remarks from the project leader and co-principal investigator for CCARPH, Professor of Sociology and Anthropology in the Ateneo de Manila University, and Science Research Fellow of the Manila Observatory, Dr. Emma Porio.
Good afternoon, friends and colleagues here in Asia. Good evening or good morning to our friends in the North and South. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Brooke WILMSEN, our first CCARPH ARETE Visiting Research Fellow for the year, for her kindness and generosity in giving us this lecture on climate justice towards gender-responsive and resilient communities. This is her second lecture here on climate justice in the Philippines. 3 weeks ago, she went to Visayas State University in Baybay, Leyte, and a CCARPH ADMU partner institution. Last year, Father Bobby Yap and President Eduardo Tolen, together with Dr. Dairit, signed an MOU with Visayas State University. There she gave a lecture on climate justice focused on post-Yolanda housing relocation and resettlement initiatives by multi-layered institutions, civil society organizations, in partnership with national agencies and local government units. Most of the CBOs and civil society groups have been working on social development, social justice, and housing rights among women, children, and other vulnerable groups. With the twin crises of our time, climate and social inequality exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the Ukraine war, all these largely disrupting the supply and value chain of products and services, in the process affecting negatively the political, economy, and the lives and livelihoods of people and institutions in urban and rural communities and their informal economies. I think the focus on climate justice and post-disaster rehabilitation has become far more important than ever. The persistence and deepening of socioeconomic inequality today has a profound impact on the resilience of cities and communities to climate change and its terrific impacts on highly exposed and vulnerable urban-rural communities. As if to add insult to injury, the countries in the global South, which find themselves more impacted by a crisis created by the actions of the global North, find themselves without adequate resources to adapt to that crisis, also due to the actions of both the elites in the global North and the global South. So what are the prospects of just adaptation, climate justice, and resiliency for informal settlers in urban rural Philippines, especially those in the informal economies? Let us listen to the insights of our keynote speaker, our first visiting research fellow for this year, Dr. Brooke WILMSEN of Trobe University, and afterwards, our panelist, Dr. Justin C. of the Environmental Institute of Sydney University. So welcome to this joint webinar of the Coastal Cities at Risk in the Philippines, the ARETE and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Ateneo de Manila. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Porio. So we now move on to the main part of our program as discussed by Dr. Emma. Our keynote speaker today is a senior lecturer in development studies in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at La Trobe University, Australia. He is the director of the Master of International Development and convener of the Major in Sustainability and Development. He is also an ARETE-CCARPH-DSA visiting research fellow of the Ateneo. Her research interests include forced displacement, involuntary resettlement, climate adaptation, social protection, and agrarian change. Let us all welcome Dr. Brooke WILMSEN.
All right. So thank you so much for having me today. I've had a great time here at Ateneo in Manila, and in particular, having been hosted by Professor Emma Porio. I met Professor Emma through Dr. Justin C. from City University, and also who was my PhD student at Trobe University, and he's now gone on to work at the University of Canberra and also now at Sydney University as a postdoctoral fellow. So our work continues, and now we also have a partnership with Professor Porio to do further exploration together and to apply for a large grant next year from the Australian government. So the research that I'm going to present today are from fieldwork conducted by Dr. C, but also from the most recent research that I've been doing while I've been here in the Philippines with, in partnership with Dr. C and Jin Kuatan and Pearly Joy Paya from the Eastern Visayas State University, where I was several weeks ago. So we haven't actually processed the data yet. The transcripts are still being transcribed at the moment by our research assistant. So this is my just initial thoughts from the research that we've been doing. So I've called this Exploring Climate Justice in Philippine Coastal Cities. So I'll be presenting 2 case studies. This is a picture that I took out in Leyte in one of the housing association resettlements in the north of Tacloban. So you can see here, some of these are not being lived in and some of them are, but I'll talk more about that as we go along. Okay, so I'd just like to begin with an overview of today's seminar. I'm going to begin with an introduction, research questions. Then I'm going to talk a bit about the theoretical framework that we've been applying, particularly in the Iloilo case. Later, I'm going to talk about where this has led us in terms of our theoretical thinking. Then I'll talk about the Iloilo Flood Control Project, our findings around climate justice, and then I'm going to talk about the Tacloban Typhoon Haiyan resettlement, and particularly reflecting on the notion of climate gentrification, which is a fairly new idea in the literature. It obviously carries on from the notion of gentrification, but there's very little research in the Global South. So this will be one of the first studies of its kind in the Global South. It's mostly looking at gentrification processes around climate change in the Global North at the moment. Then I'll talk a little bit about reflecting on these findings, some conclusions, and then talk about where we're going now. Okay, so just to begin, this research arose out of an interaction between the work I've been undertaking in China for many decades, looking at forced resettlement for development projects, and the work that Dr. Justin C, who was a scholar for many years with Professor Emma Porio at Ateneo University and still a member of CCARPH. We decided that using both our experiences, we could interrogate resettlement as an adaptation response to climate change. A number of scholars have argued that permanent resettlement of populations from areas exposed to shocks to less vulnerable locations is a potential adaptation solution to climate change. In fact, a number of scholars see resettlement as more appropriate than structural protection, which means building flood defence and seawalls, or accommodation, which means modifying existing structures to take into account potential climate change impacts. Even the IPCC, which is the body composed of experts on climate change and sponsored by the UNEP, maintains that well-designed and carefully implemented programs such as those ongoing resettlements of Indigenous communities in Alaska can improve housing standards and reduce vulnerability. However, the evidence from the research I've conducted over the last 25 years, and others like me, specifically in terms of development forced displacement projects, demonstrate potential problems with resettlement. So we find it often leads to the impoverishment of those who were forced to move. It treats relocatees as victims unable to negotiate their own interests, and it can hinder sustainable livelihood formation amongst relocated people. So there's consequently ongoing uncertainty over what the potential opportunities and constraints of resettlement as a climate change adaptation measure might be, and is therefore something very important to look at. And it's why Justin took this on as part of his main PhD research, and we're continuing on with that research today. So the research questions. So we're looking at the Philippines. Many of you will know this, you're all experts on the Philippines. So the Philippines is a very interesting case study globally. The Philippines is a very interesting case study. 20 plus typhoons visit the country annually. You can barely see the country according to the map below, which is showing the tropical cyclone that have hit the Philippines from 1946 to 2010. And yeah, it's unclear which country is below, but it is the Philippines. It's also a very dynamic country. You've got rising prosperity, widening inequality, facing sustainability challenges. We focused on the Iloilo flood control project because of the long-term planning that went into it, and the successes that have been reported from the project. And success in resettlement is something that's rarely reported. Most of the time we see intergenerational impoverishment caused by the relocation and resettlement of people. So the Iloilo flood control project relocated around 3,500 families. And the main research questions that Justin looked at in his field work, and then we wrote on in 3 papers published in Q1 journals, was fairness in processes and fairness in distribution of benefits and burdens. And we asked the question, what prospect exists for benefits and burdens and for achieving climate justice? So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about fairness. And specifically, the questions we asked were, in terms of process, who was involved in the resettlement process? How were the targets selected? How did they access the resettlement housing? And then the distributional effects. How were the benefits and costs of the project distributed? Who are the winners and losers? And in that sense, we start to get an idea of how just these kinds of approaches are as a adaptation response to climate change. So this is a photo that I took in Tacloban a couple of weeks ago, and these crosses are put on all of the houses that are going to be forcibly demolished this month. So it's, you know, it's a fairly scary, I suppose, message from the government to see that on your house. People are aware that they were going to be relocated for a long time, and the housing has been completed since 2019 in the site that we're looking at there. So several authors have explored questions of justice in relation to climate adaptation. So this literature generally adopts a Rawlsian definition of justice, which people in sociology will be familiar with. So that means the fair allocation of material and social benefits among people over space and time. So this poses the question of what is fair. So with my colleague Sarah Rogers in 2019, we looked at what prospects exist for fair adaptation through resettlement in China. And we identified 2 broad approaches to defining fairness: the responsibility-based approach and the human rights-based approach. So the former considers the unfairness between countries that emit the bulk of greenhouse gases and regions that suffer from the impacts of these emissions. So fairness in this sense requires those countries who have contributed the most to climate change bear the greatest burden in dealing with the problem, including compensating those who have borne the greatest costs, such as those living in areas threatened by sea level rise or extreme weather events. Now, the rights-based approach frames the imposition of climate change risks on vulnerable populations as a range of human rights violations, that is in more legalistic terms. So they see fairness and justice in the sense that it requires atonement for the human rights that have been violated or ignored. So both these approaches tend to be focused on fairness and justice at the international level, practical implications of climate change at the local and individual level, where the unequal geographical distribution of climate change risks is experienced. By providing a community level analysis of the lived experience of a climate change adaptation response, our research aims to address this gap in the literature. So migration and adaptation policies and programs also create winners and losers at a range of geographic scales. So winners are those who experience improved conditions, benefits and opportunities as a result of global changes, whereas the losers experience further marginalisation and increased vulnerability. With regards to climate change, losers tend to be poor, socially and geographically isolated, and lack the financial resources or government support they need to adapt. The principle of putting the most vulnerable first emerges from the climate justice literature. However, this focus on vulnerability has the perverse effect of underplaying the agency of marginalised communities, rendering them passive targets of protection efforts. And this is something that we've seen in the development forced displacement literature for many decades. So it legitimises top-down interventions in at-risk communities, undercutting the effectiveness of projects and raising concerns about justice and fairness. Now, resettlement is one such intervention that tends to be imposed. It is often portrayed as a technical and apolitical process that, when properly planned and implemented, can lead to fair and beneficial outcomes. However, such perceptions of resettlement tend to obscure its political nature, which drives inequitable adaptation to climate change. Thus, to understand fairness in climate change adaptation, we need to unpack the differential impacts of climate-induced resettlement projects and the role that power plays in state-orchestrated adaptation responses. So to this end, I'm now going to present our research methods. So the research methods that we undertook were the same at the Ilo Flood Control Project and also at the coastal relocation in Tacloban, post Yolanda. So the first I would define as a planned resettlement, and the second is really an emergency response in a lot of ways to an extreme weather event. So they're interesting sites to look at separately, but also comparatively. So we did household surveys at both sites. We did 200 households, Justin administered those, and we did 300 households in the Dreamville resettlement site, and these were administered by Pearly Joy and Jin from EVSU or FSU. Statistical analysis was undertaken of the survey data. It hasn't been completed yet for our Tacloban study, and we've also done to triangulate our survey, we've done qualitative interviews with a range of government officials, community leaders. In Tacloban, we also talked to buyers and sellers and the Housing Association as well. So we haven't done any in vivo thematic analysis yet of the transcripts because they're still being transcribed. However, thematic analysis was conducted of the transcripts at Ilo. So I'm going to begin with the first case study, and this is just a summarised version of a much longer presentation of the complexities of climate justice. So the Ilo Flood Control Project was designed to address flooding in Ilo. The city government implemented the project, and it was funded by the Japan Bank of International Cooperation from 2002 to 2010 and worth 110 million Australian dollars. So the overall aim was to renovate existing rivers and dredge canals and waterways and construct new floodways to divert water to the sea. The resettlement in Ilo is a really important case because it's known to be participatory, which is very hard to do in resettlements, non-violent, which is often not the case, particularly many resettlements that I've seen have ended up in extreme conflict situations. A project that I worked on in West Ghana created a whole lot of refugees that crossed the border into the Ivory Coast that were chased there by the army and tanks. So the fact that it was non-violent is actually makes it an important case study. And the households were resettled close to their original homes. And that usually means that the resettlement has a better chance of success because people can maintain their social networks, their economic and community relationships. And it was also awarded with the Goward Kalasag Award for Excellence in Disaster Risk Management and Humanitarian Assistance, which is testimony to how well it did. So buoyed by this apparent success, the government stated that it intends to use the Ilo flood control project as a model for other flooding mitigation projects in the Philippines, and is therefore important that we examine critically whether the IFCP does indeed represent a socially just and equitable approach to climate change adaptation. So as part of the project, the city government purchased a 16-hectare resettlement specifically for relocating 3,500 families living along the waterways and canals. The resettlement was called the Uswag subdivision, and the objective of the flood control project was noble. So the improved living standards, which is goes beyond international best practice, which really just commits to restoring living standards to the previous levels. And as you can imagine, that often people who are caught up in resettlements are quite poor or impoverished before their relocation. In committing only to restoring living standards, you're committing to restoring the same level of impoverishment that existed before the relocation. It also involved extensive consultation amongst women, the elderly, and the disabled population. And it also committed to the improvement of social and economic status of vulnerable groups. So these were really important and were outlined in a resettlement action plan document, which is actually should be a public document, but it was rather difficult to obtain. And Justin was actually able to attain it there, and you can see that's on the slide, that's a picture of the front cover of the resettlement action plan. So in terms of policy, the Philippine government has a legal basis to conduct resettlement. You're probably quite aware of this coming from the Philippines. However, what's really interesting in the Philippines is the recent legislation that tweaks that legislation in order to ensure that it can be applied to climate change. So you've got the Climate Change Act of 2009 and the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act of 2011, which requires climate change considerations to be incorporated into government plans and projects, with more funding allocated to climate change mitigation and adaptation projects such as resettlement. So the Iloilo City Urban Poor Affairs Office was the main government agency responsible for housing and resettlement in Iloilo and was the implementing agency. However, as it was the largest resettlement ever undertaken by the city government, it engaged 4 external NGOs to help out. Now, these 4 NGOs, which we won't identify, we call them NGO A, B, C and D. They all took responsibility for some of the households to be relocated, and they provided different resettlement programs as part of their engagement. So NGO A was the largest and most politically connected NGO, and it offered a superior resettlement program compared to the other 3. Importantly, it's regularly involved in resettlements in the Philippines and has a formal agreement with the city government as its preferred provider of resettlement services. And it certainly did the best job of resettlement in this case. So only 172 households of the 3,500 were referred to NGO A. And based on assessment of their household income and capacity to serve low interest loans, they were referred in to the NGO A. You can see from this table that the NGOs provided different sized housing and that NGOA had a loan arrangement whereby people would be required to commit some sweat equity, but also to attend to paying a regular loan in order to build their houses. But as a result, they ended up constructing really climate resilient housing. They learned through training and workshops how to plan and design and procure materials for housing construction. And they also had a community savings scheme, which was implemented to help resettled households build their financial capacity and fund livelihood development and housing improvements. So in contrast, 1,080 households were assisted by the other NGOs, and they were provided with houses free of charge, and they didn't have to contribute any of their own labour. And these households are only 1 story high. They're kind of that traditional row house that I showed on the first slide. Okay, now I'm going to talk about procedural fairness and look at how that played out at the Ilo flood control project. So the likelihood of a household being referred to NGOA was a function of their political capital. So one of the most important things that Justin found, and we met in a cafe back in Melbourne, and he showed me these particular endorsement letters from the local government that were endorsing people into the resettlement site that weren't even affected by flooding. So political capital was a really important way of getting access to the superior housing resettlement that provided climate resilient housing. People also had to have the capacity to pay back their loans. So that tended to siphon off the kind of wealthier households from the original cohort into NGOA. And some of the households, because of the political capital involvement in the selection, they did not necessarily meet the national requirements for resettlement, nor were their houses at risk of flooding. So this led to the sidelining of people in need of a safe place to live and climate resilient housing. And they tended to be siphoned into the other 3 NGO housing projects, which didn't actually provide for the climate resilient housing that NGOA was providing. There was also differences in participation. So I won't go through the details of the table, but what it shows is that the people in NGOA were the most satisfied with the consultation process. They attended workshops and training to learn about housing design and legislation related to housing. They were taught how to do financial estimates to procure housing materials used to the various stages of housing construction, and they were asked to contribute a small amount of money as well. And in terms of how this played out in terms of distributive fairness, which is the second part of the climate justice framework that we used in this case, we found that in terms of the distribution of benefits and burdens of the resettlement project, services were much more improved in all sites. However, they were much better in NGOA in terms of access to basic services such as electricity, water, sanitation and public transport. There were also inequalities in the improvements to these services. So those resettled under the NGOA program were more likely to have improved basic services, and the interviews corroborated these findings. So resettlers from NGOA claim access to services improved with resettlement, and they said things like, "It seems like life is better here in San Isidro. We feel like we are living in an exclusive private subdivision, which is so different from where we came from." Conversely, residents at the other NGO resettlement sites noted a range of issues, including inadequate supply of clean water, clogged sewage systems, and poor drainage. So here we've got some photos of the resettlement housing provided by the 4 NGOs. You can see the superior housing provided by NGOA and in comparison to the other 3 NGOs. And when we spoke to people in the resettlement sites, particularly in the NGOs B, C and D, they said The housing is substandard. There are several cracks on the walls. The door is not of good quality, and we need to be careful when sitting on the toilet because it can collapse. Houses were flooding, such that the residents usually started to collect big stones from the streets and then surround their house with them during heavy rains. They served as barriers so that the water would not go inside their house. And finally, perceptions of distributive fairness were also pretty clear. So there was a significant difference, and I won't go through the details of the survey, just to say that, again, NGOA really stood out in terms of their perception of fairness. And they were more likely to feel that the project improved the lives of everyone in their community, whereas there was more differentiation amongst the other NGOs' perceptions of distributive fairness. I think one of the interesting things about this project is the way in which the resettlement was planned out. So you can see here that all of the NGOs resettlements were all next to each other, which is great in terms of, promoting, or should be great in terms of promoting bonding, closeness, and social cohesion. However, in reality, what we saw, and I think this was one of the most important findings of this research, was that it generated social cleavages. And this has led on to our work on climate gentrification, because I said to Justin, I think we're starting to see evidence of climate gentrification here in this project. So in reality, the differences in housing quality are a permanent reminder that some people benefited more than others from the resettlement process, generated animosity. So there was evidence from the interviews of verbal altercations and accusations of theft which generated a discourse of fear amongst the households resettled by NGOA. So consequently, and you can see here in the photo, this is a gate, and there's a fence that's been built all the way around NGOA in order to lock themselves in at night. So they've increasingly isolated themselves in NGOA, and they express discriminatory attitudes about the people from other areas, describing their neighbours as international citizens. And that meaning they are people, and they call their compound a university. That means that it's advanced. And the other resettlements as merely secondary schools. They describe them as backward, undeveloped. And so they've constructed this wall and gate around the area to lock themselves in. So as I said, this led us on to thinking about climate gentrification. And I mentioned it to Justin, and we kind of parked the idea for a couple of years. He went on to do a postdoc at the University of Canberra, and of course COVID hit. And he said to me that he'd met this PhD student at a conference called Jin Kuatan, who is a Filipino, but was studying at Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. And he thought that what he was seeing in the sites at Tacloban was potentially evidence of climate gentrification. And he suggested that perhaps we all work together to do some research. So in terms of what is climate gentrification, and we were surprised that even with the high-level officials in Tacloban during our interviews, that they didn't know, or they couldn't guess what climate gentrification was. Even the term gentrification is kind of a Eurocentric idea that hasn't really infiltrated into political discourse here in the same ways that it has in Europe and other parts of the global north. So climate gentrification is the ways that climate risks and adaptations drive gentrification. So which is a general process by which existing residents are displaced due to economic, physical, and social investment in a community. So, for example, I live in an area that's undergoing gentrification in Melbourne. Some 30 years ago, it was an area where most of the poorest people in Melbourne lived. You had migrant communities, and it really kind of boomed after post-World War II with the Italian and Greek communities coming into the area. But in the last probably 15 years, it's really provided affordable accommodation for young professionals who want to live near the city of Melbourne. And so you've seen a real shift in the kinds of people that are living there. There's a lot less diversity. There's I would say a lot more Caucasians living there, very highly educated. and are doing up and renovating all of the old housing stock that is in the area. It's now become a very desirable place to live, but because of that, of course, the migrant communities and also a lot of the remaining Italian and Greek communities are being pushed out because they can't afford to live there, or they're cashing in on the gains that their properties have made in terms of value. So climate gentrification looks at this process, but how climate is involved in driving that change. So climate change makes some areas more or less desirable due to economic, physical and social investment in a community. So wealthy households might move into less climate vulnerable areas, potentially displacing lower income households and resulting in changes in community characteristics and demographics associated with traditional gentrification. So those who might be interested in this issue of climate gentrification, it's quite a short article actually by Carolina Best from the University of Maryland in the US. She wrote this paper in Urban Climate, but you can see it's focused on the East Coast of the United States, and most of the research is focused in the United States and the global north. So this is the second case study, which leads from the first in terms of looking at this notion of climate gentrification, and I suppose shifting from a focus purely on justice and inequality, but the way in which climate is really driving that social change. So just a reflection on our preliminary results and thinking. A lot of discussions went on during our fieldwork 2 weeks ago, and I think we're starting to really get somewhere in terms of putting together a paper with Jin, Justin, me and Pearly Joy. So this picture is of the Dreamville resettlement site. My initial reaction when I went there was that I didn't think it was as, I suppose, impressive as I thought it was going to be. But once I saw the other resettlement sites, I could see why it was somewhere that people wanted to live. And why it was so much more superior to the resettlements that had been set up by the Housing Association, the National Housing Association. So this particular resettlement is called Dreamville, and it was funded by the Catholic Relief Services. So they took on the resettlement of people from the coast, part of the coastal community of Tacloban. After post-Yolanda. And this site's really special compared to the others because the NGO took it upon themselves to do all of it, except for providing the kind of services that the government provides, like connecting to water and sanitation and things like that. So what resulted was a really diverse, vibrant, and what seems to be quite a thriving resettlement for those who can afford to live there. And that's, I suppose, the key to gentrification, right? For those who can afford to live there. So I don't really need to tell you about Super Typhoon Haiyan. I think part of visiting Tacloban was the realization, as somebody who had watched the typhoon only peripherally from afar because I just had and wasn't really taking much notice of the news, I hadn't realized the extreme nature of that typhoon, the catastrophic devastation that it wreaked across the Philippines, particularly Leyte and Samar, and that most of the people I was working with in Tacloban had their stories of survival from, and particularly in giving lectures at FSU and VSU, knowing that there were survivors who had been through harrowing experiences in the audience. And this to me, because in the past, when I've given lectures, for example, in China, I'm lecturing to, I suppose, elites. The resettlers are not wealthy enough to go to university, so they're never going to be in the classes that where I'm talking about what they've been through. So it was quite moving to be involved in that. And at the end of my lecture at FSU, the professor there asked the students to put their hand up if they had been affected by Yolanda, and almost all of the auditorium put their hand up. So at least, so the typhoon hit on November 8, 2013. and it claimed more than 6,300 lives, although we know that the numbers are probably much higher than that. And the number of people I spoke to in Tacloban said that, you know, they all seem to have somebody that they had not been, whose body had not been recovered after this after the typhoon. So at least 1.1 million homes were damaged, or and the most devastated area along the coastal district of Leyte was called Anibong in Tacloban. And this is where was the focus of our research. So the super typhoon washed away or destroyed the vast majority of houses and local infrastructure. And I think it's the stories, the ships that were pushed through that community that really struck me the most as to how devastating that had been. And one of the ships that still sits there is a memorial that you can see still in situ to where it was located after the storm. So the damage was so severe, and the risks of further destruction in the future also of concern, that the government of the Philippines declared what they call now a no dwelling zone, and compelled residents who had lived in the coastal area for generations to relocate elsewhere. Now, interestingly, that no dwelling zone was originally called the no build zone, but that shifted because it would be virtually impossible to ensure there was no building at all within a 40-metre area along the coast of the Philippines. This is really important land for people, for businesses, for big tourism institutions. So after typhoon funding flooded into the region to support post-Haiyan recovery, the Catholic Relief Services came in with a mission to seek out the poorest and most vulnerable and to assist them in the spirit of Catholic social teaching to assist with resettlement initiatives. The interesting thing that we found during our research was that this relocation was actually on the cards for a long time, and the area was earmarked before Yolanda for demolition, and in order to build a port in that area to deal with supply chain issues from Tacloban. The thing was the government didn't have money to relocate them, so this multi-generational community was allowed to stay in the Anibong site. But once the funding came into the area, the government was able to afford to forcibly displace people. And initially, for many, they were willing to go because of the fear. And in a way, the government was able to harness the fear in order to get willingness of people to move on to the resettlement sites. So the Anibong Resettlement Project supports 900 of the most vulnerable families in the Anibong community to restore their lives and livelihoods in safe, sustainable and dignified new communities. So the pictures there are of fishermen that live in the Anibong area. They've actually returned to the site, which is part of this process of gentrification, but also part of the problem of the resettlement communities, providing particularly in Dreamville, they're providing safe houses, but their livelihoods are still connected to the sea, and they have no way of really replacing those without some support in terms of livelihood programs, which beyond the sari stores really doesn't exist. So the CRS designed a new planned community that provided essential infrastructure, and it worked closely with the families to design and build disaster resilient homes that the families were expected to be able to own and hold title, often for the first time in their lives. And this was certainly very important to the people we spoke to, the ability to hold our formal title and to move from being informal to formal dwellers. So they were told that these houses were going to be provided free of charge by the CRS, but they were caught off guard by the decision to bring in a mortgage program, which loans were provided by Pagi-B, and it was a point of contention amongst the communities because they were asked to declare what their monthly income was in order to determine whether or not they would be able to afford these loans. And in many cases, people said that they embellished upon their income in order to be able to be accepted to the CRS program. And this has created problems ongoing because people haven't been able to actually pay their mortgages. So when we were in the home owner's office at Dreamville, they showed us a big stack of red envelopes that the people who had not paid their mortgages. And people were very concerned about whether or not they were going to lose their homes. So nobody had lost their homes yet, but the threat was there that they would be going to lose these important places of safety for them. So the LGU was responsible for connecting the water and roads, and we found that they were still not running water when we were there, and the roads were still insufficient. And in fact, when there was an extreme rain event, the community got cut off from the city by flooding. So there were still ongoing climate-related issues there. So the approach of CRS was really interesting, and I'd say, you know, they've certainly followed much better practice than the national authority that were responsible for the rest of the resettlement in Anibong. So the resettlement is located in Tacloban City, which is really important because the other resettlements that were conducted for the rest of the informants were way out north of Tacloban at the foot of the mountains. So they were cut off from really everything. There were no livelihoods out there. People were really struggling to stay in place. So this barangay neighbourhood was called Bagakai, and it was 4.5 miles from Anibong district and close to key regional facilities and public transport. Although it was still only a short distance, the fisher folk we spoke to said it was too far for them to be able to continue their fishing activities. The reason being was that there were a lot of fees and transportation costs in getting back and forth to the bay every day. So they had many of them had returned to the dangerous Anibong site and reconstructed houses in order to be able to continue with their livelihoods. There were plans in place in order to set up a bunk system that the government was going to build so that the fishermen could at least stay during the week on the coast to continue their livelihoods, but they hadn't been constructed when we were there, and the fishermen were very concerned that that wasn't going to happen. So the CRS worked closely with the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Palo to identify and purchase the land, which would provide a safe haven from future typhoons. So the CRS began the extensive earthwork needed prior to construction in December 2017 and began building houses in April 2018 and completed the houses in June 2019. So one of the other great things that CRS did was that they tried to continue to have continuity within the community. So they used a digital technology to assign each family a plot of land. And what they did in assigning these was they weighted the preference for their location, their plot size, who their neighbours would be. And this was cross-referenced with the preferences of all other 900 households. And so this is really different from what happened with the National Housing Authority program, where it was a raffle. And so you drew a lot based on randomness, and you could be in any number of resettlements. So most people had lost all of their social connections at the other resettlement sites. So this was really important that this was continued. It was also really close to the Eastern Visayas Regional Medical Centre, which is a university training hospital. So you had lots of facilities around there in order to the doctors. There was the likelihood of being able to rent out rooms to trainee doctors, and also some of the buyers, potential buyers for houses in the CRS site were also, we suspect, likely to come from the hospital. They also got formal land title and housing title, which they didn't get in the other resettlement sites that were run by the National Housing Authority, and we need to do more research there as to what that means for them. So this is a photo here of me and Pearly Joy interviewing a fisherman who had extreme arthritis condition that meant that he was struggling to continue fishing. He was getting the red envelopes from PAGI-B saying that he was behind on his payments, and he felt very scared about this. So he decided to sell his house and to move back to Anibong. So you can see here, rather than it being in order to cash in on the value of their houses in terms of the location of them and the climatic advantages of those houses, we found that the people we spoke to were selling because they simply couldn't afford to continue with the mortgages. And we need to do more research on this, but it seems to be that that's the key driver for people selling. So education is also better in Tacloban. So people we interviewed in the Anibong site that had returned to the site were concerned about the temporary school that was had been built in the Dreamville site, and it was supposed to be built but hadn't been constructed yet. That house there was for sale because the owner had a drug addiction and drug debts, and so was trying to sell that house in order to cover off those. And we couldn't find that person to be able to interview them. That was what their neighbour said. So what we were seeing with people at the resettlement site was kind of circular migration. They were going to the back to the Anibong site in order to fish and to run their small businesses during the week and to attend school, and then they were coming back to the CRS site on the weekend when they didn't have those commitments. Another thing that we saw was that people were going to the CRS site from other resettlement sites in order to shelter from extreme weather events, because housing in the other resettlement sites was not climate resilient, but this area was known to be safe. So people flooded into the area during extreme weather events, and they had to get in before the creek rose up and cut off the road, and then they would return once the extreme weather event passed. How are they selling their houses? Well, because they're not legally allowed to sell their houses for at least 10 years, they were mostly trying to sell them on the sly, I suppose. So this is an advertisement that we found by somebody called Tanash Legaspi. I'm leaving the name there because it's actually a false Facebook account. And we tried to contact this person, but it had been deactivated. So they're selling on Facebook. I'm now a member of many Tacloban city buy and sell groups in order to try and follow this. I'm not seeing a lot of houses coming up though. This seems to be quite an anomaly. So you can see here that they've just mentioned the location. There's a lot of information there, not even any information. Usually it says they have clean papers or something like that, and it's not. So that's different from the photo on the right, which I know it's a rental apartment, but you see these signs all over Tacloban and probably Manila too of publicly advertising that an apartment is for rent or sale. So we still need to do some research to see how this is playing out. It looks like the online sales probably most likely, and also word of mouth. Now, interesting to note too, the government is very aware of the buying and selling and going on, and they're trying to crack down on it. So it was a very sensitive issue when we were in Tacloban, which is one of the reasons why we weren't able to interview a lot of people. So we did interview one buyer, but we think he was quite savvy and knew that what he had done was illegal. So his story was that he bought it off his auntie and essentially just took over her mortgage because she was struggling with it. So whether or not he was actually a formal buyer or just a family member helping out, we weren't sure. But he had a PhD, he was a teacher and was relatively well paid. And was motivated by the possibility of having his own formally titled home. However, the government told us that there appears to be speculation going on in terms of the location of the Dreamville site and also its climate resilience. We also heard, and this was probably one of the most extreme comments I've ever heard made by a government official, that in the last mayoral elections in Tacloban, the opposition leader to the current mayor went and bought up hundreds of resettlement houses and paid 50,000 pesos per house, which were provided to the people who were happy to take it in the resettlement house, and under the proviso that they could stay in the house, but that they had to vote for him in the election. And interestingly, although the mayor won another term, the opposition leader actually won the election in the resettlement sites. So I've never seen politics play out in this way, and I suppose this is something that happens perhaps regularly in the Philippines. But very interesting how the resettlement sites are kind of sites of political contestation as well. So our hypothesis at this stage is that it's wealthy people, or relatively wealthy people, buying these homes, seafarers, health professionals working at the Eastern Visayas Regional Medical Centre, and government officials who are speculating on the value of these houses going up. And in fact, our survey suggests that the people in the houses also know that the value of their houses is going. And other potential drivers other than climate change include its important location near the hospital. Other interesting drivers of climate gentrification in this area is the shift from no build zone, and I found one of the old signs laying around, to a no dwelling zone. And how the government dealt with this was because it couldn't displace everybody living in the 40-metre zone along the coast of Tacloban. So what they did was they only targeted the informal dwellers who they were able to legally remove from that site. And the formal dwellers, they reclassified their houses as commercial. So they were no longer classed as dwelling properties, and they told them that they needed to renovate and move to the second floor of the house, which they didn't check on. So granting eligibility remain on the coast, but a way of still moving on the informals. And there's also a photo there of one of the notices that goes up in Anibong on the remaining structures of the forced demolition that's to come. Now, the people in the houses told us that the government didn't speak to them at all. They just put these signs on their structures. Okay, so I've just got 2 more slides left. Just a reflection on the 2 cases and then some conclusion. So planned resettlement is increasingly and implemented for a variety of reasons around the world, including conservation, poverty alleviation, urban expansion, and now climate change adaptation. And it's portrayed as a technocratic and a managerial tool instead of an exercise in power. The existing resettlement literature gives scant attention to questions of procedural and distributive fairness, and this study goes some way to fill these gaps. It contributes to an earlier literature that asks how climate change adaptation responses might integrate questions of procedural and distributive justice processes to ensure they alleviate rather than exacerbate inequality. The benefits of the Iloilo flood control project and the Dreamville resettlements were not shared fairly within the cohort of resettled households. The wealthiest and most politically connected were more likely to be qualified for the superior housing projects in Iloilo, and the poorer households were less likely to be able to afford to stay in their climate resilient housing in Dreamville. Just noting, we still need to do some statistical analysis of the survey data to see who is most likely to sell their properties. Our findings also reinforce the conclusions of a much larger body of literature that finds resettlement projects around the world often exacerbate inequality and generate social discord at the local level. So just to conclude, our research demonstrates how resettlement projects undertaken in the name of climate change adaptation are subverted by local political processes, resulting in unjust and potentially maladaptive outcomes. We also see inequalities reproduced and new inequalities produced through climate gentrification. So we are calling for a more cautionary approach to the use of resettlement as a climate change adaptation response. If resettlement continues to be framed as a technocratic endeavour divorced from questions of politics and power, resettlement undertaken in the name of climate change adaptation is likely to reproduce, if not exacerbate, inequality and social discord, and drive gentrification processes that shut out the most vulnerable from climate protection. So to end on a more positive note, this research also demonstrates how participation in planning and decision-making processes can foster a sense of fairness and improve adaptation outcomes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. WILMSEN. That was very, very enlightening. So I would like to remind everyone that you can send in your questions through the chat box in Zoom, or if you prefer, you can send them to me directly. And so we move on to our first commenter. So he is a postdoctoral research associate in climate change adaptation at the Sydney Environment Institute. Please welcome Dr. Justin C.
Thank you, Dr. Emma and Dr. Brooke WILMSEN, for your presentation. I have a few minutes just to give some comments with regards to that very enlightening talk by Brooke. So here goes. Dr. WILMSEN's presentation provides another example, of what we call in the literature as maladaptation. That is when adaptation to climate change can just simply go wrong. And the problem with maladaptation is that aside from the wasting of money and time, it renders people even more vulnerable to climate change. And this is indeed sobering news, but there is a silver lining to all of this. Climate change scholar Professor Neil Adger, in his recent lecture at the Environmental Protection Agency, states this, and I quote, "Climate change adaptation has the potential to make us happier and healthier if it is well designed." So as part of my reaction to Dr. WILMSEN's lecture, I would like to reflect on this particular question. How do we design adaptations that can enhance people's well-being and sense of security? And to do so, I'd like to highlight 3 important points that I've drawn from the case studies that Dr. WILMSEN presented. First, we have to frame the social back into the picture of climate disasters. Loss and damages are always stratified by social, historical, and political economic arrangements that render some groups more secure while others more vulnerable. And so I urge you, in the work that you do, whether you're in academia, whether you're in industry, in government, or in development, to stop with the climate reductionism, right? That's the framing of disasters as if they were result of stressors that just fall from the sky. Okay? Loss and damages are grounded. They're outcomes of pre-existing vulnerabilities that are situated in the ground, in the communities. And so one important step towards designing adaptations that can enhance well-being are initiatives that analyze what the root causes of people's vulnerabilities are and addressing them in the first place. Second, you have to seriously decolonize climate change adaptation practices. There's just too many of these top-down, expert-driven, technocratic approaches to climate change adaptation. It's time that we place the community members themselves, the people, at the center of adaptation practice. Dr. WILMSEN's results show us what happens when other concerns, other than that of the community members, take priority. So, meaningful community engagement is very important in planning these types of projects. Community engagement and adaptation should go beyond consultation. I understand people are so tired of being consulted. So there should be more to adaptation program than just those free meriendas or the ayudas that are given so that people will participate. Adaptation projects should help build people's agency through deliberative and negotiated processes. And central to this is the sharing of power, the sharing of project ownership, and the sharing of decision-making to vulnerable members of the community. Lastly, we have to politicize climate change adaptation. And Brooke has touched upon so many times how politics plays an important role in resettlement. But research into adaptation, into resettlement has been really scarce in terms of analyzing power and the politics and how it is produced, in conjunction with socioeconomic factors and how this determine how people in communities, especially in the global south, respond to climate change. As the findings from the case study of Dr. WILMSEN show, no matter how good your adaptation plan is, politics can derail these good plans and still can yield to inequitable outcomes. So I guess it's time that we really continue to critically interrogate the global and local power structures and the resulting political inequalities that determine some people's ability to benefit while others do not. So to end, adaptation to climate change is a highly political process that cannot be reduced to building seawalls or offering livelihood diversification projects alone. We need to address the different socioeconomic manifestations of vulnerability, of poverty, of landlessness, gender. In other words, the interrogation of the origins of vulnerability. That's all, and I hope you find that comment helpful. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. C. So now we move on to our second speaker. So she is currently the head of the Gender Resource Center and an associate professor of the Visayas State University. Please welcome Mr. Sita Tabada.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to answer the last question. I guess I've been privileged to have listened to the presentation of Dr. WILMSEN at the Visayas State University, and then this afternoon to listen to her again. I think first I'd just like to share often our reactions, because for the university and for many of the climate researchers in the university, climate justice is a relatively new concept. And I think to have listened to somebody who has worked on it for the past 25 years and looked at it from the perspective of our own places here in the country, in Iloilo and in Tacloban, has really been very enlightening for us. And it's also timely and very relevant because, of course, we all know we experienced Yolanda in 2013, and then we had Odette in 2021. And then just last year, almost a year, we had Agaton and landslides that occurred and killed almost 200 people in the city of Baybay. I think what is also of value for us listening to those presentations and now is really, I think, the framework that has been provided for us to rethink how we do our climate researches, particularly the issue of resettlement. This is something that is really or should be of concern to us in the university, because our city is starting its own resettlement program for all those who were affected by Typhoon Agaton last year. And visiting the site the following day after Dr. WILMSEN's presentation, we realized that there is still so much that needs to be looked into, the way the resettlement is done, the planning, and even how the people, how it is impacting the people now, a year after, or almost a year after Agaton happened. I think what the important, point that was presented also is the idea of power, because it really came out how those having power will be able to benefit even at the expense of the communities that were impacted, and they come out doing good, if you want to put it that way, when in fact they're capitalizing on what happened during Agaton. For the communities, especially for the community that had the most damage, they feel that they believe that the experience was really caused by practices like the unregulated sand mining in the area, in the river, and how they believe that there's a relationship between the landslides and the deepening of the rivers. Of course, we need the science to be able to look at it, but you see right away the powers, and if you look at who are doing all this mining and who are benefiting, then you begin to see why there's very little efforts to look at what is actually going on in these areas, but rather to capitalize on the idea that this has happened because the soil has there's certain qualities of the soil that are there that makes it prone to landslides. So I think this has been an eye opener for us, and it also challenges us actually to go back, because it's almost a year. And when Dr. WILMSEN was asking, have we been to the site, have we done work on it, we haven't done. That was the first time I visited the relocation site. So made me realize that there are things that need to be addressed, and I think that was looking at what is going on in the resettlement areas is our way of ensuring that we use the science that we have in order to hopefully influence decision making, policy making at the LGU level, and ensuring that more of those vulnerable communities will not experience the same natural disasters that because of what people have been doing, what the powers that be doing what they want to do at the expense of communities who are unaware, who are unable to defend themselves or protect themselves. So I think this is a positive step for us. The work of climate change, from looking at it from the perspectives of climate justice, and ensuring that the work that we will be doing will now consider all the parameters that have been presented in the case studies that we heard of. So thank you very much, Dr. Brooke and Dr. Emma, for the opportunity to share.
Thank you very much, Ma'am Tess. All right, so we can open the floor for questions from those in the audience. Just looking at the chat box, there have been no questions that have been sent to me, but those who would like to raise their hands and comment on what you have heard so far, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Greg, would you like to comment? We're basically holding this webinar for you.
Oh, really? That's
I'm making a joke, but there's some truth to it.
we're talking about disasters and people who've been well, there's not a dose of justice for many people who've been relocated because of these disasters. I think of the people who lived in Japan, in Fukushima. More than 50% have not returned to their home after so long, no? And yet we keep using these kinds of phrases like "build back better," and I have a hard time reconciling those two. And maybe our speaker and the responders can comment on it, because we have this kind of rah-rah mentality that we can build back better, and yet some of these crises are just so wicked that I those kinds of words just leave me I guess I'm at a loss. Okay, so that's my comment.
Would you like to comment on that, Brooke, or Justine, or Tess?
I suppose in terms of the build back better, I've never liked that term. It sounds like a great idea, but the politics and power and the apolitical kind of underpinnings of that term are not brought to bear when you put it in those terminologies. And I heard a new one the other day from Emma. What was that one? Build right first sight. Build right at first sight. So these kinds of there's not much meaning in them, is there? Because they're just slogans. And the problem is that they get caught up, they get taken up by the development sector, and they get thrown around, and they start to lose any meaning that they might have had in the first place as they can become normalized. But actually, how do we build back better when you're working within a very complex environment? And it is very hard to take a community and move it to another location. The Anibong community had been there for several generations, although informal. There was, it was organic. It had developed up in a way that's impossible to reproduce that in a new location, no matter how good your technocratic planning is. So I think that those kinds of terminologies simplify the complexities in those kinds of relocations that are becoming so much more common now. So I think Justin's got a comment too.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, that the term building back better is associated with resilience, which is now.
Justine would like to comment.
Can you hear me? The term building back better is associated with building resilience, which is in the literature is quite criticized as being, in two ways. First, being as a cop-out to no responsibilities and possible interventions that are that could be done by certain agencies and governments who are responsible for responding to it. But second, as a way of promoting and perpetuating status quo responses to, perpetuating what the normal, basically business as usual responses. So given this wicked problem, as Dr. Greg would said, we need really innovative kind of solutions and, just not the same usual way of doing it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We now have a question from the chat box from Mr. Randel Owen Salvador. He said, Naomi Klein's concept of disaster capitalism seems to play out in the case studies, or is it just one dimension seen?
I completely agree. I think this is, one part of disaster capitalism, probably more localized disaster capitalism rather than, I think a lot of disaster capitalism studies is focused on the more big players in the disaster sector coming in and making money off people's trauma and the kind of disasters that have occurred to create opportunity for some. So we can see here a kind of localized disaster capitalism whereby people are speculating on the responses to disaster in order for their own self-interest in the future. So I think that's a really good comment, Rendell.
I would like to respond to Greg. Yes, I myself do not like this build back better because you can never build back better. Money, and also another thing that was mentioned in the COP27 about build right at first sight. And I was asking, what's the science base of all of this? And they can answer. I like Maniana's framework when he says, bounce forward better together. Maniana's framework really looks at disasters or disruptions as opportunities for the communities to reconfigure and do things together and work towards rehabilitation together. And if you look at this framework, it really tells you about the different pathways that communities can take better or in rehabilitation, depending on how well organized the community is and how supportive the local and national governments are. So I think your question, Greg, about, these are all nice words. And yes, the disasters, you can, even in the 2006 tsunami, I went back to Banda Aceh, 10 years after, and they're still there. So the same with Japanese victims of the Tohoku earthquake. So I think these are very intractable, very hard to track these kinds of what I'll say, desirables. But I would say that just because these things are not happening according to what we want it doesn't mean we don't strive at all to reach that kind of desirable of climate justice. That's what I mean. I think those concepts and how they might play out in reality, how perhaps we can reach them, are there as guidelines and as well as checks for us to work better and the like. Yeah. Thank you, Joy.
Thank you, Dr. Emma. So it seems like there are no more questions. So we go back to you, Dr. Porio, for the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Brooke and Justine and Tess, for all these inputs to our continued discussions on climate justice or just adaptation. Let us now thank our speakers. We have our excellent presentation by Dr. Brooke WILMSEN, and our panel of distinguished panelists, Dr. Justine C. and Ms. Tess Tabada of the Visayas State University. Visayas State University is a key partner of CCAR and Ateneo de Manila. Given the discussions here today, it is clear that we need to look closely at the pre, during, and post-disaster interventions and the investments with a climate justice lens. Let us remember, however, that climate justice lens is crucial as in interrogating settlement and relocation schemes and the different systems embedded in these schemes. In these programs that are internally and externally defined, we have to remember that these are all embedded in a systems. We should also be mindful that the policies and programs intended to bring justice to displaced communities who have the least contribution to the warming of the earth and our oceans do not result to maladaptation, but a just adaptation. The conditions, I think, of just or transformative adaptation as a major pathway to community resilience has been eloquently defined by our speakers. So I will not elaborate on these dimensions of climate justice anymore as how it plays out. If you remember or listen closely to their presentations, you'll find out that climate justice is played out in the social, political, and economic hierarchies of communities and their risk governance systems within and without. Therefore, I would just like to urge everyone here to be mindful of the intended and unintended consequences of our policy and program designed actions. As often said, the road to both heaven and hell are paved with good intentions. Thank you very much. May I invite you to visit our 3 websites, especially the Resilience Toolkit page, because we made that for CCADR practitioners and professionals, and hopefully to those who are mindful of the science that informs climate adaptation resilience building, both at the global and national and local levels, especially those who are working with local government units, civil society organizations, community-based organizations, and the private sector. You are free to download the materials in our site, but please acknowledge our intellectual property rights when you use it. I have seen several downloads, but there's no acknowledgement at all. So thank you very much for your kind attention. We will have more webinars coming in your future. We will please keep track of it in our website. So thank you very much. I really appreciate, those people from Iloilo. Hi, Sonia, and these people from VSU. I see many friends here in the audience. So thank you, Justine. That's Tess. Justine and I have been continuing all this work since 2010, and I'm very happy that now we're joining together with your former advisor, Brooke, and hopefully we should continue our interrogations of climate justice, climate adaptation towards a more, shall we say, fairer and more, shall we say, gentler world that we've compared to what we have now. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Porio. Before we let everyone go, can we request everyone to put on your cameras, turn on your
Yeah.
cameras, so that
This is
we
for
can.
documentation. If you notice in our website, in our coastalcities@riskph.com, you will see some of our webinars there posted. So we will post some of your pictures in one of our websites. So
Okay, thank you very much, everyone.
all right, thank you. Salamat.